A homeless Navy SEAL bought a collapsing carriage house for $10. His old war dog uncovered a buried military secret. At 59 years old, Mason Carter had lost everything except his retired military dog, Ranger. Homeless and sleeping in a freezing pickup truck outside Roanoke, he spent his last $10 on an abandoned carriage house hidden deep in the Appalachian Mountains. But the moment Ranger entered the loft, the old K9 began growling at a wall untouched for nearly 60 years. And what they found behind it would rewrite Mason's entire life. Comment 1 if you believe loyalty never dies, or 0 if you think some secrets should stay buried. And tell us where you're watching from. The November rain came down in long silver sheets across the Walmart parking lot outside Roanoke, Virginia, turning the rows of empty shopping carts into crooked shadows beneath the buzzing yellow lights. A faded blue Ford pickup sat alone near the far edge of the lot beside a strip of dead winter grass where runoff water gathered in shallow black puddles. The truck had once belonged to a landscaping company in North Carolina. The company logo still showed faintly beneath the rust along the doors. Inside the cab, Mason Carter slept in fragments, not real sleep, the kind that came in short, exhausted collapses between memories. He sat reclined beneath an old military wool blanket, with one hand resting unconsciously near the combat knife, tucked beside the driver's seat. His gray beard had grown uneven during the last 2 months, and deep lines cut through the weathered skin around his eyes. At 59, his body still carried the thick shoulders and hard frame of a Navy SEAL, but time and grief had hollowed something inside him that combat never managed to touch. Beside him, Ranger lay stretched across the bench seat. The Belgian Malinois was 12 now. Gray had spread heavily around the muzzle, and old scars crossed the dog's chest beneath thinning fur. One ear folded slightly from an injury sustained years earlier during an operation that Mason never spoke about anymore. Even asleep, Ranger's body remained alert beneath the blanket, his paws twitching occasionally, as if still running patrols through some distant desert village that only he could remember. Rain hammered softly against the windshield. A tractor trailer hissed past on the interstate beyond the hill. Mason's eyes remained closed, but his breathing never fully slowed. People who had never lived through combat imagined PTSD as explosions and screaming. They imagined men waking in terror every night. Sometimes it was quieter than that. Sometimes it was simply the inability to ever completely rest again. The dashboard clock glowed 2:14 a.m. Mason had parked there 3 nights already. The manager usually left him alone as long as he moved before sunrise and didn't cause trouble. He kept the truck clean, never drank, never panhandled, never made eye contact longer than necessary with anyone walking past. Invisible men survived longer. The cold pressed through the doors despite the blankets. Mason opened his eyes slowly and stared through the fogged windshield toward the enormous blue Walmart sign glowing through the rain. For a few seconds, he forgot where he was. Then memory returned all at once. The hospital room, Linda's oxygen machine, the way cancer had eaten through her in 11 months after 34 years of marriage. The mortgage notices stacked unopened on the kitchen counter afterward. The foreclosure, the storage unit auction, the silence of an empty house after she was gone. Mason swallowed hard and rubbed both hands slowly over his face. Ranger lifted his head immediately. "You okay, buddy?" Mason whispered. The dog's tail thumped once against the seat. That dog had saved his life more times than Mason could count. Not only overseas, but afterward, too. Especially afterward. Mason reached down and scratched gently behind Ranger's ears. The dog leaned into the touch without opening his eyes fully. Outside, the rain intensified. Water rolled in crooked rivers down the windshield, while the parking lot lights reflected across the glass like distant fire. Mason checked the fuel gauge again. Less than a quarter tank. Enough enough for maybe another day if he kept the heater off. He glanced toward the folded envelope, sitting on the dashboard. Past due. Final notice. The VA disability payments barely covered food anymore. After the medical debt collectors started garnishing portions of it, Mason had stopped answering unknown phone numbers weeks ago. He leaned his head back again, closed his eyes, tried once more to drift. Then Ranger growled low, deep, instant. Mason's eyes snapped open. Every muscle in his body locked at once. Ranger was no longer lying down. The old Malinois stood rigid on the seat, staring through the passenger side window into the darkness beyond the parking lot lights. His ears stood forward. The growl deepened in his chest. Mason's pulse exploded. Adrenaline flooded him so fast it hurt. In one motion, he grabbed the knife beside the seat and turned toward the window. His breath shortened automatically. "What is it?" Ranger didn't move. Rain distorted the world outside into shifting silver shadows. Mason scanned fast. Tree line. Shopping cart return. Dark sedan. No movement. But Ranger kept staring. The growl grew sharper. Then suddenly, bang! A metal dumpster lid slammed somewhere behind the building in the wind. Mason flinched violently, and for one terrible instant, the parking lot disappeared. He was back in Kandahar. Mortar fire, dust, gunfire cracking through alleyways, a radio screaming for extraction, blood running beneath his gloves while Ranger barked beside him through smoke and debris. Mason's breathing spiraled instantly. Too fast. Too shallow. His vision narrowed. Not here. Not now. Ranger turned immediately. The dog pressed both front paws against Mason's chest and forced himself into the older man's space, whining softly. It was grounding behavior from training years earlier, still remembered perfectly. Mason shut his eyes hard, focused on Ranger's weight, the warmth of fur, the smell of wet dog and old canvas. Not Afghanistan. Parking lot. Virginia. Rain. Safe. Slowly the panic loosened its grip. Mason exhaled shakily. Easy, he whispered to himself. Ranger rested his muzzle against Mason's shoulder, but kept glancing toward the darkness outside the truck. Still alert. Still uneasy. Mason followed the dog's stare again. Nothing. Only rain and shadows. But something about Ranger's posture bothered him. The old dog wasn't acting afraid. He was acting aware. There was a difference. After several minutes, Ranger finally settled back onto the seat, though he remained restless the rest of the night, lifting his head repeatedly toward the passenger window, as if listening for something too distant for human ears. Mason never managed to sleep again. By dawn, the rain had slowed into mist, drifting low across the mountains west of town. The Walmart lot slowly filled with morning traffic. Mason folded the blankets carefully, checked Ranger's paws for stiffness, and fed him the last of a can of beef stew, mixed with dry kibble, from a Ziploc bag. "Breakfast of champions," he muttered. Ranger ate slowly now because of his age, but his eyes never left Mason while he chewed. Mason himself drank black coffee from a gas station paper cup and ignored the ache in his stomach. At 7:30, they drove toward the Roanoke Public Library. The truck heater barely worked. Cold air leaked through cracks in the doors, while old country music whispered through static on the radio. The Appalachian Mountains rose dark and enormous beneath low clouds beyond the highway. Mason had always liked mountains. Something about them reminded him of men who kept their pain to themselves. At the library parking lot, Ranger climbed carefully from the truck and walked close beside Mason toward the entrance. Several people glanced nervously at the large military dog, but Ranger ignored them completely. Inside, the warmth hit Mason immediately. The smell of books, old carpet, coffee from the staff lounge. He removed his soaked ball cap and nodded politely to the librarian, who already recognized him from previous mornings. "Morning, Mr. Carter?" "Morning." He settled into a computer near the back wall while Ranger lay beneath the desk. He searched county listings, foreclosures, tax auctions, storage sheds, farm lots, and abandoned structures. Mason searched mostly out of habit now. Looking at properties cost nothing. It gave his mind somewhere to go besides memory. Outside the windows, fog drifted slowly through downtown Roanoke. An hour passed, then Mason saw it. Appalachian Regional Surplus Property Listings. Under Black Hollow Ridge, Franklin County, one property sat near the bottom. Abandoned carriage house. Built 1,891. 2.4 acres. Sold as is. No utilities. Structural instability. Auction reserve. $10. There was only one photograph. A massive weathered carriage house, sitting alone at the edge of a dead field beneath gray mountains. Stone lower walls, tall wooden loft, a broken slate roof, and something about it stopped Mason cold. The place looked forgotten. Not ruined. Forgotten. Like an old soldier nobody visited anymore. Beneath the desk, Ranger suddenly stood. The dog pressed his nose against Mason's elbow and stared directly at the computer screen. Mason frowned slightly. "You see it too." "Huh?" Ranger gave a low sound in his throat, not a growl. Almost recognition. Mason looked back at the photograph. Mist curled through the hills behind the building. One upstairs loft window hung slightly open. Darkness filled the interior beyond it, and for reasons Mason could not explain, the hair along his arms slowly rose beneath his jacket. The listing closed in 48 hours. $10. Mason leaned back silently in the chair, while Ranger remained standing beside him, eyes fixed on the image of the carriage house. Outside the library windows, snow began falling lightly across the mountains. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The old dog's ears remained forward, his body tense, in a way Mason had not seen in months. Ranger usually ignored television screens, passing cars, strangers, even barking dogs outside the truck windows. Age had dulled many things in him, but not his instincts. And right now, every instinct inside the dog seemed fixed on that photograph. Mason studied the listing again. Black Hollow Ridge, Franklin County. Abandoned carriage house. No utilities. Unsafe structure. $10. The photograph looked like something pulled from another century. The long gravel lane leading toward the building had nearly disappeared, beneath weeds and dead winter grass. Bare oak trees surrounded the property on three sides, while the Appalachian foothills rose dark and endless behind it beneath heavy clouds. It should have looked hopeless. Instead, Mason felt something strange settle inside his chest. Not hope exactly. More like recognition. He clicked through the remaining county documents. Built in 1891. Original owner. Boone Transport and Feed. Last occupied in 1964. Tax forfeited in 1998. Structural citations unresolved. One sentence caught his attention. The property contains former military transport markings of historical interest. Mason frowned. Military transport markings on a carriage house. He glanced down at Ranger. "What do you think, old man?" Ranger stared back at the screen. Then the dog gave one short huff through his nose and sat down beside the desk without taking his eyes off the photograph. Mason shook his head slowly. He muttered, "I got the same feeling." The librarian wheeled a cart of returned books past the aisle and smiled gently at him. "You finding anything good today, Mr. Carter?" Mason hesitated. "Maybe." By noon, the snow had thickened over Roanoke. Traffic moved slowly through downtown, while gray clouds lowered over the mountains. Mason stepped outside the library with Ranger beside him, collar jingling softly in the cold. The old pickup started hard. The engine coughed twice before finally turning over. Mason sat gripping the steering wheel, while the heater rattled weakly against the windshield fog. Black Hollow Ridge was almost 3 hours southwest. He checked his wallet. $38. Enough gas if he drove carefully, maybe. He looked at Ranger again. You want to go see it? The dog lifted his head immediately. That settled it. The highway west wound through long stretch of mountain road, where fog drifted low across the valleys, and old barns leaned tiredly beside frozen fields. Snow came and went in bursts. Sometimes the sky opened briefly to reveal dark blue ridgelines stretching endlessly toward Kentucky. Mason drove mostly in silence. The truck heater barely worked, so Ranger stayed tucked beneath an old army blanket on the passenger seat. Occasionally, Mason reached over absent-mindedly to rest a hand against the dog's shoulder. The farther west they drove, the emptier the roads became. Small towns appeared and vanished. Closed gas stations, weathered churches, feed stores with hand-painted signs, rusting tractors sitting half-buried beside dead cornfields. At a diner outside Rocky Mount, Mason stopped long enough to buy coffee and 2 scrambled eggs divided onto paper plates. The waitress looked at Ranger and smiled softly. Military dog. Mason nodded. Retired. Well, she said quietly while pouring coffee into his chipped mug. He carries himself like he still has a job. Mason looked down at the old Malinois stretched beside the booth. Yeah, he said. He probably thinks I'm the job. The waitress laughed gently, but Mason didn't, because it was true. By late afternoon, the mountains narrowed around the highway, and signs for Black Hollow Ridge finally appeared along the roadside. Population: 642. The town itself sat in a shallow valley, surrounded by thick pine forest and abandoned tobacco fields, silvered by early snow. Most of the buildings along Main Street looked 50 years older than they actually were. Brick storefronts sagged slightly beneath faded signs, while pickup trucks lined the sidewalks outside the hardware store and feed supply. People noticed strangers there, especially homeless-looking strangers driving rusted trucks with military dogs. Mason parked outside the county administration building, beside an old courthouse clock tower. The moment Ranger jumped down from the truck, conversations nearby quieted slightly. Mason ignored it. He and Ranger entered the building together, boots echoing softly against worn tile floors. Behind the front desk sat an older woman with silver hair pinned neatly behind her head and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She looked up calmly as Mason approached. Her eyes moved first to Ranger, then to Mason, and something in her expression changed almost immediately. Recognition. Not of faces, but of pain. You must be here about the Boone Carriage house, she said softly. Mason blinked. How'd you know? The woman smiled faintly. Because nobody else has asked about that building in 7 years. She extended her hand. Clara Whitmore. Mason Carter. Her handshake was firm despite her age. Ranger sat quietly beside Mason, watching her carefully. Clara glanced down at the dog. Well now, she said. Aren't you handsome? Ranger's tail tapped once against the floor. My husband flew medevac helicopters in Vietnam, Clara said while reaching beneath the desk for a thick property file. I've spent enough years around military dogs to know the good ones when I see them. Mason felt his guard lower slightly. Clara opened the file across the desk. The paperwork smelled faintly of dust and old paper. The Boone Carriage house sits about 4 miles north of town off County Road 12, she explained. The roof is unstable in places, and the foundation has shifted on the east side. No running water since the ADS. Most folks around here think it ought to be torn down. Who owned it? Elias Boone. Clara adjusted her glasses carefully. A World War II Army mule handler, who later returned to transport duty during the Korean War. He came home afterward and never quite fit back into regular life again. Mason understood that sentence better than most people ever could. He lived there alone for nearly 30 years. What happened to him? Clara paused. He died in 1984. Heart attack, they said. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the courthouse windows, though some folks claim he spent his last years waiting for someone. Mason frowned slightly. Waiting for what? Clara closed the file. That depends who you ask. Outside wind rattled against the courthouse windows. For a moment, the room grew strangely quiet. Then Clara slid a heavy iron key across the desk toward him. If you want to look at the place before tomorrow's auction closes, go ahead. Mason stared at the key. Just like that, Clara smiled softly. Mr. Carter, nobody else wants it. 20 minutes later, Mason's truck crawled slowly along a narrow mountain road lined with skeletal trees and abandoned pasture fencing. Snow drifted steadily now, whitening the fields and hillsides around them. The farther they drove, the more isolated the landscape became. No houses, no lights, only mountains and silence. Then the road curved sharply around a stand of pine trees, and Mason saw it. The carriage house stood alone at the top of a long, dead field beneath the darkening sky. Massive, weathered, still standing. Stone lower walls rose from the hillside, like something carved directly from the mountain itself. Above them towered the enormous wooden upper loft, its faded red siding, worn almost gray by decades of wind and snow. One section of slate roof had partially collapsed inward near the north side, and dead vines twisted around the lower stable doors. Yet, despite the decay, the structure carried a strange dignity. Like an old soldier refusing to fall, Mason parked silently at the edge of the field. Neither he nor Ranger moved for several seconds. Wind swept across the valley, carrying the sharp scent of snow and pine. Then, Ranger suddenly climbed down from the truck fast, much faster than usual for his age. The dog trotted directly toward the carriage house without hesitation. Ranger! The old Malinois did not stop. Mason followed quickly across the frozen grass. Their boots crunched softly through thin snow as they climbed the hill toward the massive structure looming above them. Up close, the building felt even older. The stable doors stood nearly 12 feet tall, reinforced with rusted iron bands, darkened by time. Faded military stencil markings remained barely visible near one corner of the wood. Mason touched them lightly. U.S. Army transport. His pulse quickened slightly. Why would Army markings be here? Before he could think further, Ranger suddenly bounded through a narrow opening beside the stable door and disappeared inside. Ranger! Mason stepped into the darkness after him. Cold air filled the enormous interior. Dust drifted through narrow shafts of dying daylight, leaking between warped wooden boards high overhead. 6 horse stalls lined both sides of the central aisle, their heavy oak beams scarred by age and use. Rusted chains still hung from hooks beside feeding troughs. The place smelled of old wood, hay dust, stone, and something else, something buried beneath decades of silence. Ranger moved ahead through the aisle without hesitation, not exploring, tracking. Mason followed slowly, boots echoing softly against the packed dirt floor. Then the dog stopped. At the far end of the building, a wide staircase climbed toward the loft overhead. Ranger stood at the bottom, staring upward, completely still. Mason felt cold, move slowly along the back of his neck. The old dog began climbing the stairs, one careful step at a time. The loft stretched wide and shadowed beneath the steep roof beams above them. Snow drifted lightly through small openings in the slate roof, while long strips of fading evening light crossed the dusty floorboards. Ranger walked straight toward the north wall, then stopped. The dog's body went rigid. His ears rose forward, and very slowly, Ranger stared directly at one warped section of wooden wall, near the far corner of the loft, not moving, not blinking, as if he recognized something hidden behind it. Mason stepped closer. The old boards looked no different from the rest of the loft, but Ranger would not take his eyes off them. Outside, wind moved softly through the mountains as darkness settled across Black Hollow Ridge, and deep inside the abandoned carriage house, the old military dog began to growl. The sound rolled low through Ranger's chest while he stared fixedly at the warped section of loft wall. Mason stopped beside him. The air inside the loft had turned sharply colder since sunset. Snow drifted through cracks high in the roof beams, floating slowly through narrow shafts of fading blue light. Somewhere below them, old wood creaked softly as the mountain wind pressed against the enormous structure. "What is it?" Mason whispered. Ranger didn't move. The dog's eyes remained locked on the wall. Mason stepped closer carefully. The boards themselves looked ancient, but ordinary enough. Rough pine planks, iron nails blackened with rust. Nearly 60 years of dust settled thick into every seam. Still, something felt wrong. Or maybe not wrong. Hidden. Mason reached out slowly and touched the wood. Cold, much colder than the surrounding boards. Before he could think further, Ranger suddenly barked once, sharp, explosive. The sound echoed violently through the giant loft. Then the old dog backed away, not frightened, alerting. Mason's instincts tightened instantly. He swept the flashlight beam across the loft. Nothing moved. Only shadows. Dust. Ancient beams stretching overhead like the ribs of some enormous dead animal. Then, crack. A loud splintering sound exploded above them. Mason reacted without thought. Move. He grabbed Ranger's harness and lunged sideways across the loft floor just as a massive beam section crashed down where they had been standing seconds earlier. Wood shattered. Dust burst upward in choking clouds. The entire loft trembled violently. For several seconds, the old carriage house groaned around them, while debris rained onto the floorboards below. Then silence returned. Mason remained crouched protectively over Ranger, heart hammering. The old Malinois pushed himself upright immediately and shook dust from his coat. "You okay?" Ranger licked Mason's hand once. The beam that had fallen was enormous, rotten through at the center. Mason stared at the splintered wood lying across the floor and felt cold realization settle through him. Another step forward, and it would have crushed him. Ranger had warned him again. The old dog moved back toward the wall almost immediately. Same spot. Same rigid stare. Mason exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he murmured. "I'm paying attention." Night closed fully around the mountains. By the time Mason decided to leave the loft, the snow outside had thickened into a steady fall, whitening the fields beyond the carriage house and softening the dark ridgelines surrounding Black Hollow Ridge. Inside the stable level below, Mason found an old tack room tucked behind the eastern stalls. The room smelled heavily of leather, damp stone, and dust, but the roof overhead seemed mostly intact. Good enough. He carried 2 army blankets from the truck, along with a duffel bag, lantern, dog food, and the small propane camp stove he'd been living off for weeks. Ranger followed closely beside him the entire time, never straying far. Mason noticed that too. Military dogs developed patterns after enough deployments. Ranger had always shadowed him during missions, but lately the dog stayed closer than ever, as if afraid Mason might disappear. The tack room contained an old cast-iron wood stove near one wall, its pipe still running upward through the stone ceiling. Beside it sat stacks of collapsed wooden crates and rusted horse tack hanging from hooks. Mason brushed dust from the stove with his sleeve. Still usable. An hour later, a small fire crackled softly inside it, spreading slow warmth through the room, while snow hissed gently against the roof outside. Mason heated canned stew over the camp stove, while Ranger rested beside the fire, wrapped partly in a wool blanket. The flickering orange light softened the old dog's scars. For the first time in weeks, Mason felt something dangerously close to comfort. Not happiness. He no longer trusted happiness, but shelter, stillness, a roof, the kind of simple things a man begins valuing after losing almost everything else. He handed Ranger pieces of warmed beef from the stew can. "You realize this place should probably be condemned." Ranger ate quietly. Mason leaned back against the stone wall. "When Linda was alive," he said softly, "she always said, I had a talent for finding broken things." The words surprised him. He had not spoken Linda's name aloud in days. The fire popped softly. Outside, wind swept through the valley, carrying the distant groan of tree branches shifting under snow. Mason stared into the flames. Cancer had taken Linda slowly, cruelly, slowly. At the end, she weighed less than 100 pounds. Mason had carried her from bed to wheelchair and back again for nearly 3 months, while pretending not to notice the fear in her eyes. Every time she apologized for becoming a burden she never understood. She had never been a burden. Losing her had felt like losing the last civilian part of himself. After that, the military version of Mason Carter simply kept moving because motion was easier than grief, until there was nowhere left to move except parking lots. Ranger lifted his head suddenly, alert again. Mason followed the dog's gaze toward the ceiling. The loft above creaked softly in the wind. Ranger stood slowly, then walked to the tack room door and stared upward toward the darkness overhead. "You still thinking about that wall?" The dog's ears twitched. Mason sighed quietly. "Tomorrow." Ranger remained there another moment before finally returning beside the stove. But long after midnight, Mason woke to sound above them. Footsteps slow, heavy, crossing the loft overhead. Mason's eyes snapped open instantly. Every nerve inside him sharpened. Ranger was already standing beside the door, silent and rigid. The footsteps came again. Creak. Pause. Creak. Too heavy for settling wood. Mason reached automatically for the pistol locked inside his duffel bag, then stopped himself. No, not unless necessary. He grabbed the flashlight instead. The footsteps stopped completely. Silence returned. Only wind, only snow. Mason listened hard. Nothing. After several tense minutes, he finally relaxed. Slightly. Probably old beams shifting under temperature changes. That happened in mountain buildings. Still, Ranger did not settle back down. The dog remained staring upward toward the loft for nearly another hour, before finally lying beside the stove again. Morning arrived gray and bitterly cold. Snow covered the valley in smooth, untouched white, stretching all the way to the tree line beyond the fields. Smoke drifted faintly from chimneys in distant farmhouses scattered through the mountains. Mason stepped outside carrying a tin cup of coffee while Ranger trotted slowly through the snow nearby. The Carriage house looked different in daylight. Less haunted, more abandoned. Its limestone lower walls rose thick and solid from the hillside, while faded redwood siding towered above beneath the damaged slate roof. Massive stable doors stood crooked on rusted hinges, and ancient wagon tracks remained faintly visible beneath the snow leading toward the road. Mason walked slowly around the structure, studying the damage, roof repairs, foundation cracks, rotting beams. Too much for one man, especially one with $38. Still, he found himself mentally calculating repairs. Anyway, near the back corner of the building, he noticed something burned into one of the support beams beneath the loft overhang. He brushed snow away carefully. Faded black lettering emerged beneath the grime. U.S. Army Pack Transport. Mason frowned. Not freight transport. Pack transport mules. He stepped back slowly. That explained the stable size. Army mule teams had been critical in mountain warfare before helicopters became widespread. Korea, Italy, Burma, places vehicles couldn't reach. But why keep the markings after the war? Why preserve them here? Before Mason could think further, the sound of an approaching truck echoed faintly through the valley. A rusted flatbed pickup crawled slowly up the lane toward the carriage house. The driver climbed out before the engine fully died. Big man. Heavy coat. Gray beard. Stained yellow near the mouth. From cigarettes. He studied Mason with immediate distrust. Then his eyes shifted toward Ranger. Well now, the man muttered. Is not seen that dog before. Mason Carter. Curtis Vane. No handshake followed. Curtis spat tobacco into the snow and glanced toward the carriage house. You really buy this place? Thinking about it. Curtis snorted. Hell of a place to die. In winter. Mason said nothing. Curtis walked slowly toward the stable doors, boots crunching heavily through snow. My daddy hauled scrap out of this valley 30 years, he said. Tried buying this property twice. After old Boone died. County never budged. You know Elias Boone? Everybody around here knew him. Curtis rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. Strange old man kept to himself. Spent half his life hauling junk in and out of that loft. What kind of junk? Curtis glanced toward the loft windows. Military stuff mostly. Mason felt Ranger stiffen beside him. Like what? Crates, trunks, papers. Curtis shrugged. People said he thought the government was hiding things. You believe that? Curtis smirked slightly. I believe old men hide valuables when they don't trust banks. The wind swept harder across the field. Curtis looked at Mason carefully now. You planning to stay here for now? Curtis studied the carriage house one long moment. Then Ranger. The old Malinois stared back without blinking. Finally, Curtis sighed. Well, he muttered. Don't say folks didn't warn you. He climbed back into his truck. Before leaving, he rolled down the window once more. If your dog starts acting strange up there at night, Curtis said quietly, listen to him. Then the truck disappeared slowly back down the snow-covered lane. Mason stood watching until it vanished beyond the trees. Beside him, Ranger suddenly turned toward the carriage house again, toward the loft, toward the wall, and once more, deep in the old dog's chest, the growl returned. Snow drifted sideways across the valley, while Mason stood in the frozen yard, staring up at the loft windows. The carriage house seemed to watch him back. That feeling irritated him. He had spent most of his adult life crushing instincts like that before they could become fear. Fear got men killed. Superstition got them worse than killed. Still, Ranger was not wrong. Often the old Malinois stood rigid beside him, amber eyes fixed on the loft overhead, while cold winds stirred the gray fur around his muzzle. Mason finally exhaled through his nose. Fine, he muttered. We'll take another look. Inside the enormous stable level carried the bitter smell of old timber and melting snow. Morning light slipped through cracks in the outer walls, illuminating floating dust high above the stalls. Somewhere in the structure, water dripped steadily from roof runoff. Ranger moved ahead immediately toward the staircase. Not excited. Purposeful. That bothered Mason more. The dog climbed the steps carefully, because of his age. Paws thudding softly against old oak boards, polished smooth by generations of boots and horseshoes. The loft felt colder than before. Mason swept the flashlight beamed slowly across the warped walls and rafters, while Ranger returned to the same section of boards near the north corner. Same position, same stare. The growl faded into a low rumble. Mason approached carefully this time. He studied the wall more closely. The boards looked hand-cut, older than the surrounding timber. Narrow iron nails secured them in uneven spacing. One plank, near the center, carried a slight inward bow, almost invisible beneath decades of dust. Mason knocked against it lightly. Solid. He moved to another section. Solid again. Ranger suddenly placed one paw against the bowed plank, then looked directly at Mason. The old dog's eyes carried the same expression they used to during deployments, when he detected explosives hidden beneath dirt roads overseas. Focused certainty. Mason swallowed slowly. "You smell something?" Ranger whined softly. It was not fear. It was urgency. Mason crouched lower beside the wall. There was a draft. Very faint. Cold air moved through a narrow crack near the bottom board. Before he could inspect further, something else caught his attention nearby. Half buried beneath collapsed hay and debris, sat an old military footlocker, pushed against the wall several feet away. Rust covered most of the metal corners. Mason moved toward it carefully. The lock had already broken long ago. When he lifted the lid, dust exploded upward into the flashlight beam. Inside lay stacks of yellowed papers tied with faded cloth ribbon. Ledgers. Mason lifted the top one carefully. The leather cover cracked softly beneath his fingers. Boone Transport Records, 1951 to 1954. Ranger stopped growling immediately. The dog walked over and sat beside Mason, while he opened the brittle pages. Inside were names. Rows and rows of names handwritten in careful dark ink. Military serial numbers, transport dates, rail schedules, cargo designations. Mason frowned deeper as he turned pages slowly. This wasn't farm inventory. It was military logistics documentation. Note, he recognized the formatting instantly. Convoy manifests, freight transfers, personnel movement records. Some entries carried strange symbols besides certain names. A black circle, a slash mark, a small cross. Beside a few names, one word appeared repeatedly, returned. Others had nothing written beside them at all, only blank space. The loft creaked softly overhead, while snow tapped against the roof. Mason kept reading. The 12th of January, 1953. Transfer route. Blue Ridge Line. 7 wounded personnel. 2 military working dog units. Weather delay. The 3rd of February, 1953. Delayed arrival. Freight reassigned. The 18th of March, 1953. No official confirmation received. Mason's pulse slowed into that sharp, focused rhythm he remembered from reconnaissance work overseas. Details. Missing pieces. He looked toward Ranger. You knew something was up here. The old dog rested his head gently against Mason's shoulder. For the next hour, Mason searched through the trunk while daylight shifted pale and cold through the loft windows. More ledgers, maps, transport schedules, old military supply forms. One folded newspaper clipping slipped loose from between 2 pages. Local mule handler returns home from war. 1,946. The grainy photograph showed a younger Elias Boone standing beside 2 massive army pack mules in front of the very same carriage house. Boone looked thin and deeply tired even in black and white. His eyes reminded Mason of veterans he'd known after long deployments. Men who came home physically, but left important parts of themselves elsewhere. Ranger suddenly stood again. The dog returned to the wall. Scratch. Scratch. Soft, controlled, not destructive, almost patient. Mason watched him carefully now. The old Malinois was not trying to attack the wall. He was trying to show him something. The realization sent a strange chill through Mason's chest. Outside, the snow finally stopped by late afternoon, leaving the valley wrapped in cold silver light. Mason carried several ledgers downstairs into the tack room, while Ranger followed close behind. He spent the rest of the evening beside the wood stove reading. Hours passed quietly. The ledgers contained far more than transport records. Some entries became deeply personal. The 2nd of March, 1953. Private Harold Beckett requested transfer home after loss of left leg. Says his dog still searches for him during night checks. The 11th of April, 1953. Sergeant Nolan refusing morphine again. Claims train noises remind him of shelling near Chosin. The 4th of May, 1953. Heavy fog crossing ridgelines. Men restless tonight. Mason read every line, slowly. Outside. Darkness settled early across Black Hollow Ridge, while the fire snapped softly inside the stove. Ranger slept beside the warmth at first, but every so often the dog lifted his head toward the ceiling, listening, always listening. Mason turned another page, then stopped. One entry near the bottom carried darker ink than the rest. The 18th of June, 1953. No confirmed arrival. 3 personnel unaccounted for. Orders received to amend official manifest. Mason stared at the sentence. Amend. Official manifest. His stomach tightened. Military language. Cold language. The kind designed to make disappearance sound administrative instead of human. Ranger rose quietly and crossed the room. The old dog rested beside Mason's chair. Mason scratched absently behind his ears while continuing to read. Without realizing it, he began speaking the names aloud. Private Harold Beckett. The room remained silent, except for firewood, settling softly inside the stove. Sergeant Nolan Pierce. Ranger's breathing slowed. Mason turned another page. Corporal James Holloway. Something strange happened then. The tightness inside Mason's chest eased slightly. Only slightly, but enough to notice. He frowned again. He read another name aloud. Lieutenant Aaron Mills. The words settled differently spoken, then read silently. More real, more human. The names stopped being ink on paper. They became men. Men somebody once knew. Men somebody once waited for. Ranger lowered himself beside the chair and finally relaxed completely for the first time all day. Mason stared into the stove flames. Back in Afghanistan, after difficult operations, his team sometimes gathered at night and quietly recited names of lost operators over cheap, instant coffee and dust-covered radios. No speeches, no ceremonies, just names, so nobody disappeared completely. He had not thought about that in years. Outside, mountain winds swept through the valley, carrying distant tree creaks through the darkness. Mason opened another ledger. More names, more rail schedules, more missing confirmations. Hours passed. The ritual continued. Name after name. The deeper into the records he read, the calmer his breathing became. Even the constant ache beneath his ribs, the pressure he carried every waking moment since Linda died, softened slightly beneath the steady rhythm of the names. Near midnight, Ranger suddenly lifted his head. The dog stared toward the ceiling again, then toward the loft stairs. Mason followed his gaze. Silence. Then a faint sound above them. Not footsteps this time. Dragging slow, wood against wood. Mason stood immediately. The chair legs scraped across stone. Ranger was already at the door, every muscle tight. Mason grabbed the flashlight and moved toward the stairs. The beam cut upward through darkness as they climbed slowly toward the loft once again. Cold air rolled down from above. The loft stood silent when they entered. Dust drifted lazily through flashlight beams. Nothing moved. Then, Mason saw it. One of the boards near the strange wall had shifted, only slightly, but enough to reveal a thin, dark crack behind it. Ranger approached the wall slowly, then sat, waiting. Mason stepped closer. The crack had not been there before. He touched the loosened board carefully, and from somewhere deep inside the hidden space beyond the wall came the faint smell of old paper and machine oil. And something else. Something military. Mason stared at the narrow darkness behind the board, while Ranger remained perfectly still beside him. Then very quietly, almost like a man speaking inside a church, Mason whispered, "What were you trying to protect up here, Elias Boone?" The loft answered only with silence. Cold mountain wind slipped through the warped boards and stirred the dust around Mason's boots, while Ranger sat beside the loosened plank, unmoving. The smell coming from the narrow crack behind the wall lingered faintly in the air. Old paper, machine oil, metal. Mason reached toward the shifted board carefully, but the instant his fingers touched the wood, Ranger let out a sharp warning bark. Mason froze. The old dog stood immediately and pressed against his leg, forcing him backward. What? Then Mason heard it too. A deep groan rolled through the loft overhead. The storm was coming. Outside the high windows, the sky had darkened almost black over the mountains. Wind bent the pine trees hard along the ridges, and snow whipped sideways through the valley in thickening waves. Another groan echoed through the carriage house. Structural. Heavy. Mason stepped back from the wall slowly. "Not tonight," he muttered. "Whatever's in there's been waiting nearly 60 years. It can wait one more." Ranger continued, staring at the crack another moment before finally backing away. Together they descended into the stable level below, while the first real blast of winter slammed into Black Hollow Ridge. By midnight, the storm had fully arrived. Snow hammered the carriage house so hard it sounded like handfuls of gravel thrown against the walls. Wind screamed through gaps in the roof, slates rattling beams overhead, while old chains hanging beside the stalls clinked softly in the darkness. The entire building felt alive. Mason sat beside the wood stove, wrapped in a wool blanket, with Ranger sleeping near the fire or pretending to sleep. The old dog's ears still twitched at every sound above them. The stove struggled against the cold. Frost had already begun forming along the inside edges of the tackroom windows. And every few minutes, Mason had to feed another piece of broken crate wood into the fire to keep the room warm enough. His flashlight rested beside the chair. The ledgers sat stacked carefully near the stove. Outside, the storm worsened. The wind carried a strange sound across the valley now and then. Long, hollow cries rising through the mountains like distant train whistles. Mason looked up sharply the first time he heard it. Ranger did too. Another groan rolled through the loft overhead. Mason rubbed tired hands over his face. No sleep tonight. Not in weather like this. He opened one of the ledgers again instead. The pages crackled softly near the firelight. The 14th of December 1952. Heavy snow over ridge crossings. Animals restless all evening. Train delayed 12 hours. Mason frowned. Another page. The 7th of January, 1953. Pack units arrived injured from mountain derailment rescue exercise. Dog handlers exhausted. Mountain derailment. The phrase lingered strangely in his thoughts. The wind outside exploded suddenly against the building, hard enough to shake the walls. Ranger surged upright instantly. Then came the noise crash. Something enormous struck the roof above the loft. Mason jumped to his feet. The carriage house trembled violently. Snow and dust poured through the ceiling cracks. Move. Ranger was already moving. Mason grabbed the ledgers instinctively and shoved them into the duffel bag, while another cracking sound echoed overhead. Part of the roof was giving way. The storm had become dangerous. A second crash thundered from above. This time Mason heard wood splitting directly over the tack room. The old military instincts returned instantly. Assess. Move. Survive. He grabbed the lantern and rushed toward the stable aisle with Ranger close beside him. The huge central space looked ghostly beneath the swinging lantern light. Snow blew through fresh holes in the roof high above, while beams groaned under the pressure of ice and wind. Another section of slate shattered somewhere outside. Mason scanned fast. The safest part of the structure appeared to be beneath the thick limestone arch near the central stalls. Come on. He and Ranger moved quickly through the aisle. Then the storm triggered him. It happened without warning. A deafening boom shook the carriage house, as another beam collapsed somewhere overhead. The sound hit Mason's nervous system exactly like incoming mortar fire. Instantly, the stable vanished. Afghanistan replaced it. Heat, smoke, radio chatter screaming through static, blood running beneath shattered concrete. Mason stopped breathing correctly. His pulse exploded. The lantern slipped from numb fingers and hit the dirt floor sideways, throwing wild shadows across the stalls. Ranger spun immediately. The old Malinois rushed back toward him and barked sharply. But Mason no longer saw the carriage house. He saw burning vehicles, dead Marines, dust storms, swallowing entire streets. His body locked hard with panic. The flashback came faster and deeper than usual. The cold, stable aisle dissolved into pure combat memory. Mason stumbled backward against a stall door, gasping. "No," he whispered hoarsely. Ranger jumped against his chest hard. The dog's weight slammed Mason back into the present for half a second. Then another thunderous crash sounded overhead. Mason flinched violently and covered his head. Ranger barked directly into his face. Once. Twice. Again. Then the old dog did something he had not done in years. He climbed completely into Mason's lap and pinned him against the stall wall with his full weight. Grounding pressure combat recovery training. The same method military therapists had spent months reinforcing after Mason returned home from his final deployment. "Look at me," Mason whispered shakily. Ranger held eye contact unbroken. The dog's breathing remained steady, despite the storm raging around them. Mason focused on that breathing. In, out, in, out. Not Afghanistan. Virginia snow carriage house. Safe. Slowly, the panic loosened. The flashback retreated inch by inch. Tears burned unexpectedly behind Mason's eyes. Not from fear, from exhaustion. Ranger rested his muzzle against Mason's chest, while the storm screamed outside. "You're still saving my life," Mason whispered. The old dog thumped his tail once. For nearly an hour, they remained beneath the limestone arch, while the blizzard battered the mountains. Mason kept one arm around Ranger's shoulders, while snow drifted through broken sections of roof above them. Eventually, the worst of the collapsed sound stopped. The building settled again, still damaged, still standing. By 3:00 inches the morning, the storm had reached full strength. Visibility outside vanished entirely behind white swirling darkness. Wind howled through the valley, hard enough to shake the stable doors against their hinges. Mason finally managed to relight the lantern. The tack room ceiling had partially caved in, burying half the stove beneath debris, too dangerous to stay there now. He moved their blankets instead into one of the empty horse stalls beneath the thickest stone section of wall. The stall still carried rusted iron hooks and an old feeding trough along one side. Faded letters remained carved into the wood above the entrance. Mason brushed snow from the carving carefully. August. Probably a draft horse, once housed there decades ago. He spread to the blankets across old straw remnants, while Ranger circled twice before lying beside him. The storm continued without mercy. And yet Mason realized something strange as he stared into the lantern light beside the old dog. For the first time in months, he was not alone with his thoughts. The ledgers, the names, the carriage house, the hidden wall, something larger than his own grief, had begun pulling at him. Some unfinished thing. The realization unsettled him deeply. Near dawn, Ranger suddenly lifted his head again. The dog stared toward the loft overhead. Then, slowly, very slowly, he began growling. Mason followed his gaze upward, into darkness. At first, he saw nothing. Then lightning flashed faintly through the high loft windows. And for the briefest instant, Mason thought he saw movement crossing the upper loft near the hidden wall. A shadow, human-shaped, gone immediately when darkness returned. Mason sat upright fast, his heart hammered again. Ranger barked sharply toward the ceiling. Another flash of lightning illuminated the loft windows overhead. Empty. Only blowing snow. Mason exhaled hard. Probably exhaustion. Probably. Still. Sleep never returned. At sunrise, the storm finally weakened. The mountains outside lay buried beneath nearly 3 feet of snow, transforming Black Hollow Ridge into a silent, frozen wilderness. The carriage house had survived barely. Broken roof sections now exposed parts of the loft directly to the sky. One corner of the stable level sagged visibly lower than before, but the north loft wall still stood untouched. Ranger climbed the loft stairs the moment daylight appeared. Mason followed slower this time, exhausted and stiff. When they reached the wall, the crack between the boards had widened slightly during the storm, enough now to slide fingers fully inside. Cold air breathed outward from the darkness beyond. Ranger sat beside the opening, quietly waiting. Mason stared at the hidden space a long moment. Then he reached for the loose board with both hands and began to pull. The plank resisted at first. Old wood groaned softly beneath Mason's grip, while dust drifted down through the cold morning light. Ranger stood beside him, absolutely still, every muscle tight with focus. Mason pulled harder. Suddenly, the board shifted free with a dry, cracking sound. A narrow opening appeared behind it. Cold air rolled outward, carrying the smell of old paper, oilcloth, machine grease, and something metallic buried beneath decades of dust. Ranger stepped forward immediately, not aggressive, reverent. Mason widened the opening carefully, removing a second board beside the first, until a hidden compartment emerged within the wall itself. It stretched nearly 4 feet deep between the outer planks and the true stone wall behind them, and inside lay history. For several long seconds, Mason simply stared. The compartment had been packed carefully with military precision. Everything wrapped, stacked, protected, as if the man who built the hiding place believed someone important would eventually find it. At the very front rested 3 army footlockers, coated in gray dust. Beside them sat canvas-wrapped bundles tied with faded cord and several oilskin envelopes sealed in wax gone brittle with age. A folded American flag lay across the top of everything else. Mason's chest tightened instantly. The flag had been folded properly. Military burial fold, 13 triangles, perfect corners. Whoever placed it there had done so with respect. Ranger lowered his head toward the flag and sniffed softly. Then the old dog sat beside the compartment, without making another sound. Mason reached carefully inside. The nearest footlocker carried faded white lettering across the lid. U.S. Army Rail Transport Division, 1953. His pulse quickened. He dragged the locker slowly into the loft light. The metal lock had already rusted apart decades ago. When Mason lifted the lid, the hinges screamed softly through the silent loft. Inside lay dozens of military dog tags. Hundreds, maybe. Some wrapped carefully in cloth bundles. Others tied together with old string. Mason picked one up slowly. Private Richard Vale. A positive Protestant. Another belonged to Sergeant Noah Tillman. Another belonged to Lieutenant Benjamin Hart. The coldness in Mason's chest deepened. These were not collectibles. They were the remains of lives. Beneath the dog tags rested stacks of sealed letters. Some addressed to mothers, some to wives, some to children. None appeared mailed. Ranger suddenly nudged Mason's elbow with his nose. The dog stared deeper into the compartment. Mason followed his gaze. Toward the back wall sat a cedar chest, unlike everything else around it. Smaller, cleaner, preserved carefully beneath layers of oilcloth. Words had been burned into the lid by hand. For whoever still understands duty, Mason swallowed hard. The mountains outside stood silent beneath fresh snow, while weak sunlight filtered through the broken roof above them. Nothing moved, no wind, no birds. Even the valley itself seemed to hold its breath. Mason pulled the cedar chest carefully into the light. The brass latch remained untarnished beneath the dust, maintained, protected. Before opening it, he searched the rest of the compartment. More ledgers, photographs, military rail maps, canvas army money sacks, heavy, with silver coins. One wrapped bundle contained old military patches and insignia. Another held black and white photographs of wounded soldiers standing beside transport trains in deep mountain snow. Then Mason found something that stopped him cold. A leather military K9 collar, old, cracked with age. Army serial plate still attached. Ranger approached immediately. The old Malinois sniffed the collar slowly. Then, unexpectedly, he whimpered. A low, soft sound Mason had not heard from him in years. The dog laid down beside the collar carefully. Mason stared at him. "You smell another working dog?" Ranger kept his nose against the leather. For the first time since arriving at the carriage house, Mason realized the old Malinois had not merely been curious about this place. He had recognized something, not visually, by scent. The hidden compartment carried traces of military animals long gone. The realization sent chills through Mason's arms. He sat back slowly against the loft wall, while dust floated around them in the pale light. Then finally he opened the cedar chest. Inside rested a thick, leather-bound journal, a Colt Army revolver, wrapped in cloth, several military commendation ribbons, a folded rail map stained dark at one corner, and one sealed envelope resting carefully on top. The handwriting across the envelope remained surprisingly clear. To the next watchman, Mason stared at the words a long moment, then carefully broke the seal. The paper inside crackled softly as he unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, but heavily pressed into the page, as though written by a man forcing himself to remain steady. If you are reading this, then the carriage house still stands. And if the carriage house still stands, then perhaps memory has not died yet. My name is Elias Boone, former U.S. Army Pack Transport Division, Korea, 1951 to 1953. What you have found here does not belong to me. It belongs to the men whose names were removed. Mason's heartbeat slowed. He kept reading. In February of 1953, A military hospital transport train derailed in the mountains north of Black Hollow Ridge during a blizzard while carrying wounded soldiers west from Norfolk. Several train cars went into the ravine below the ridge crossing. Weather prevented full recovery operations for nearly 3 days. Many bodies were recovered. Some were not. Orders came afterward to amend manifests and reduce public reporting to avoid political embarrassment during ongoing negotiations overseas. Certain names disappeared from official records, but not from mine. Mason stopped breathing for a second. Outside the loft windows, snow drifted softly from the roof edges into the valley below. The only sound came from old beams, creaking gently overhead. Mason continued reading. I could not save those men, but I refused to let them vanish. So, I carried what remained home with me. The letters, the names, the records, the tags, the photographs, because somebody should remember who they were. Mason lowered the page slowly. Ranger rested beside him quietly. The old dog's eyes never left the cedar chest. Mason looked deeper inside. More envelopes, each labeled carefully. Notification letters never sent. Personal effects unconfirmed dead. His throat tightened. Years in the military had taught him exactly what happened when governments needed inconvenient truths buried quietly. Paperwork changed. Records vanished. Families received partial stories. And eventually, memory itself became easier to erase than preserve. Mason suddenly understood why the names in the ledgers calmed him. Because somebody had fought to keep them human. Not statistics, not logistics, human beings. He opened the journal next. The first pages described mountain transport routes through Virginia during the winter of 1953. Then came weather reports, train schedules, injury counts, and finally, the 17th of February 1953. Snow, worsening by evening. Rail operator advised against crossing Hollow Ridge. Orders overruled. Mason's jaw tightened. Another page. The 18th of February, 1953. Derailment occurred at 2:13 a.m. Visibility near zero. Fire spread through rear medical cars. Men trapped inside. The handwriting grew shakier farther down the page. Dogs would not leave the wounded, even while the cars burned. Ranger lifted his head instantly. Mason looked down at him. The old Malinois stared directly at the journal now. Another line followed beneath it. One shepherd stayed beside a dead handler until snow buried them both. Mason shut his eyes briefly. He had seen military dogs do things overseas that most civilians would never believe. Dogs stayed, always. Sometimes longer than men could. The loft suddenly felt unbearably heavy with memory. Then Ranger stood abruptly. The dog moved toward the loft windows overlooking the valley and growled low again. Mason followed. Down below, near the tree line, a pickup truck sat partially hidden beside the road. Curtis Vane's truck, watching the carriage house. Mason narrowed his eyes. The truck remained there another minute, then slowly backed away into the snow-covered road and disappeared. Ranger continued staring long after it vanished. Mason looked back toward the hidden compartment, toward the letters, the dog tags, the forgotten names, and for the first time since Linda died, something stronger than grief began rising inside him. Purpose. Not fully formed yet, but alive. The storm had uncovered more than hidden records. It had uncovered responsibility. Mason sat quietly beside the cedar chest, while pale winter light faded slowly across the loft. Then he unfolded Elias Boone's letter again and continued reading. And halfway down the next page, he found a sentence that made his blood run cold. One of the missing soldiers carried the name Carter. Mason stared at the line, while the winter light faded slowly across the loft. For a moment, He forgot how to breathe. Ranger remained beside him, silent and alert, while cold mountain wind slipped through the broken roof overhead. Carter. The name sat on the page like a live wire. Mason looked back at the journal carefully. The handwriting beneath the sentence had become darker, pressed harder into the paper. Lieutenant Samuel Carter, Rail Security Detail, status unconfirmed following derailment. Mason's pulse began thudding heavily inside his ears. Samuel Carter, his father's name. Slowly, Mason lowered himself onto the dusty loft floor beside the cedar chest. No, it couldn't be. His father had abandoned them. That was the story his mother told his entire childhood. Samuel Carter left home 2 months after returning from Korea. No goodbye, no explanation. Just gone. End of Lash. This, com, ru, rye. Mason remembered his mother standing at the kitchen sink in their small Virginia apartment late at night, smoking cigarettes beside an open window after too many bills arrived. Your father loved the army more than us, she used to say quietly. Some men don't know how to stay. Mason had believed it. For nearly his entire life, he had believed it. And yet, now his eyes drifted slowly back toward the journal. Lieutenant Samuel Carter. Status unconfirmed. Ranger rested his muzzle gently against Mason's knee. The old dog seemed to sense the shift happening inside him. Mason swallowed hard and kept reading. The 18th of February 1953. Train crossing Hollow Ridge at reduced speed due to ice accumulation. Dua, 3:00 a.m. Rear transport cars lost rail contact entering North Curve. Medical cars, 3 through 6, left track and entered ravine. Heavy fire followed. Recovery impossible until storm eased. Mason turned the page carefully. The next several entries described chaos, snow waste, deep, frozen equipment, wounded men trapped inside twisted rail cars, while rescue teams struggled through blizzard conditions. Then came another line. Lieutenant Samuel Carter remained with rear security teams, attempting K9 extraction. Mason closed his eyes briefly. K9 extraction. His father had worked with military dogs. Nobody had ever told him that. Ranger shifted slightly beside him, while silence settled across the loft. Outside, the storm clouds had finally broken apart over Black Hollow Ridge. Pale sunlight stretched across the snow-covered valley below like cold silver fire. Mason opened another oilskin packet from the cedar chest. Inside lay photographs. Most showed soldiers standing beside rail cars somewhere deep in the mountains during winter operations. Then one photograph slipped free and landed face up across Mason's knee. A younger man stood beside a German shepherd wearing army transport gear. Tall, dark hair, sharp jawline. The resemblance hit Mason instantly. The same eyes. The same shape around the mouth. His father, younger than Mason, had ever seen him. The photograph had been folded carefully around the edges from repeated handling. On the back, faded handwriting read, Samuel and Bear, Winter Transport Route, January 1953. Ranger sniffed the old photograph slowly, then licked the corner gently. Mason stared at the image while memories rose unexpectedly from places inside himself he had buried long ago. A smell of aftershave and motor oil. Large hands lifting him onto broad shoulders. A deep laugh. Tiny fragments he could never tell were true memories or stories borrowed from his mother. His mother had removed nearly every photograph of Samuel after he disappeared. By the time Mason turned 10, it almost felt easier to believe his father had never existed at all. Until now. Mason looked deeper into the chest. Another packet contained military commendations, Bronze Star citations, rail service commendations, transport operation records. One citation carried Samuel Carter's name again, awarded for actions during winter mountain rescue operations involving military working dogs under severe weather conditions. Mason leaned back slowly against the wall. The loft suddenly felt too small, too full, too close. His entire life had been built around one central truth. His father abandoned them. That belief shaped everything afterward. The military, the anger, the distance he had kept from his own son, the inability to trust permanence. And now, a dead mule handler, hidden inside an Appalachian carriage house, was quietly dismantling all of it. Ranger whined softly. Mason rubbed both hands across his face. "You ever spend your whole life hating somebody?" he whispered. "Then find out maybe they never got the chance to come home." The dog remained pressed against him, steady, warm, alive. Outside, the snow reflected pale afternoon light into the loft, while wind moved softly through the trees below. Mason forced himself to continue reading. The journal entries grew increasingly personal after the derailment. The 22nd of February 1953. Orders arrived from Washington. Manifest revisions required. Casualty totals reduced pending investigation. Several bodies were unidentifiable due to fire damage. Families were to receive amended reports where necessary. Mason's jaw tightened. Amended reports. Military language again. Cold language. Language designed to hide suffering behind paperwork. Another page. Lieutenant Carter never left the ravine. Refused evacuation while dogs remained trapped. That line struck Mason harder than anything else so far, because he understood it completely. Military handlers did not leave dogs behind. Not the good ones. Never. Mason looked toward Ranger. The old Malinois watched him quietly. A memory surfaced suddenly from years earlier in Afghanistan. An explosion. Collapsed walls. Smoke choking the air. Mason trapped beneath debris, while Ranger clawed through shattered concrete trying to reach him. The dog refused extraction twice, until Mason was pulled free. Military dogs always stayed. Mason lowered his eyes back to the journal. Further down the page, Elias Boone's handwriting had become uneven. "I argued against changing the records. I was told certain truths serve no purpose after war, but names matter. Men matter. Dogs matter. So I carried what remained here." The next page contained a rough hand-drawn map of the rail line through the mountains north of Black Hollow Ridge. One section had been circled repeatedly in dark ink. Hollow Ridge Curve. Beside it, Boone had written, "Some cars were never fully recovered." Mason's heartbeat slowed dangerously. There was more. Far more. And somehow his father sat directly in the center of it. Ranger suddenly lifted his head sharply toward the loft stairs. A vehicle approached outside. Mason rose immediately and crossed toward the loft windows. Below, a dark SUV climbed slowly up the snowy lane toward the carriage house. Not Curtis Vane this time. Different vehicle. Cleaner. Modern. Ranger growled low. The SUV stopped near the stable doors. A man climbed out wearing a charcoal overcoat and expensive boots poorly suited for mountain snow. Mid-30s, clean haircut, tired face. Mason recognized him instantly. Travis. His son. For several seconds, Mason simply stood frozen. He had not seen Travis Carter in almost 11 months. Not since the argument after Linda's funeral. Down below, Travis stared up at the carriage house with visible disbelief. Then his eyes found the old pickup, parked beside the barn. Ranger remained tense beside the window. Mason exhaled slowly. Damn it! Travis entered the stable level below. Moments later, his footsteps echoed sharply through the old structure. Mason. Not Dad. Mason. The distance between them sat inside that single word. Mason descended the loft stairs slowly with Ranger beside him. When Travis finally saw the condition of the carriage house interior, he stopped dead. Snow leaked through broken roof sections. Blankets lay piled inside horse stalls. Lantern light flickered weakly against stone walls. And there stood his father beside an aging military dog, in the middle of it all. Travis looked stunned. "You're living here." Mason folded his arms. "For now, you disappeared. I changed phone numbers. You stopped answering calls." Mason said nothing. Travis ran frustrated hands through his hair while looking around the ruined stable. "You're sleeping in an abandoned barn in the mountains. It's a carriage house." Jesus Christ. Ranger moved closer to Mason's leg. Protective now, Travis noticed immediately. The younger man's expression softened slightly at the sight of the old dog. "At least, Ranger's still keeping an eye on you. He always does." Silence settled awkwardly between them, the kind only family can create. Finally, Travis looked upward toward the loft. "What's up there?" Mason hesitated, then glanced toward Ranger. The old Malinois stared silently back. And deep inside Mason Carter, something shifted again. For the first time in years, he realized this story might no longer belong only to the dead. Snowlight drifted faintly through the broken roof, while Travis stood near the stable entrance, staring around the carriage house in disbelief. The silence between father and son felt heavier than the old beams overhead. Ranger remained beside Mason, posture calm but alert. Amber eyes fixed carefully on Travis. Not threatening. Watching. Always watching. Travis rubbed both hands together against the cold and looked toward the horse stalls lining the massive room. "You're actually living here," he said quietly. Mason nodded once. "It's temporary. End. Of quote. Travis rubbed both hands. "That's what you said about sleeping in your truck." Mason said nothing. The younger man's frustration sharpened immediately. "I've been trying to reach you for weeks. My phone broke. That's not the point." The wind pushed against the carriage house walls with a low, hollow groan. Snow slipped through broken roof slates and melted slowly against the dirt floor between the stalls. Travis looked exhausted, not physically, emotionally. Mason recognized that look because he had worn himself most of his adult life. His son removed his gloves slowly and shoved them into his coat pockets. "You could have called me. You got your own life. That doesn't mean I stopped being your son." The words landed hard. Mason looked away toward the loft stairs. Ranger shifted slightly beside him. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Travis noticed the open duffel bag near the tack room entrance. Several ledgers and old photographs remained visible inside. "What's all that?" Mason hesitated. The instinct to shut people out rose automatically inside him, especially family, especially when things mattered. But Ranger looked up at him then, steady, patient. The same look the dog used overseas whenever Mason needed to slow down before making a bad decision. Finally, Mason exhaled quietly. "There's something upstairs," Travis frowned. "What kind of something? I'm still figuring that out." They climbed to the loft. Together. The cedar chest remained open beside the hidden wall, while afternoon light stretched pale and cold across the dusty floorboards. Travis stopped halfway across the loft. "What the hell?" Mason watched his son absorb the scenes slowly. The dog tags, the army footlockers, the old flag, the letters. Travis knelt carefully beside the chest. "You found all this here?" "Hidden inside the wall." Ranger moved closer and sat beside the cedar chest protectively. Travis picked up one of the dog tags carefully. His expression changed immediately. The same thing had happened to Mason. The tags felt different once a person touched them, heavier than metal should feel. These are real, Travis whispered. Yeah. Mason handed him Elias Boone's letter. For several minutes, the only sound in the loft came from wind moving softly through the broken roof overhead while Travis read. His face tightened gradually with every page. Then finally, Jesus. Mason leaned against one of the support beams. Yeah. Travis looked back toward the hidden compartment. All these men, most of them, disappeared from the official records. That can't happen. Mason gave a tired, humorless laugh. It can. The younger man turned another page slowly, then stopped. His eyes lifted toward Mason. Samuel Carter. Mason's jaw tightened instantly. Travis looked confused. That was Grandpa's name. Mason nodded once. You think it's him? I don't know what to think. End quote. B. Grandpa's. The wind outside strengthened briefly, rattling loose roof slate above them. Travis stared down at the photograph of the younger Samuel Carter, standing beside the German shepherd. He looks like you. Mason looked away immediately. The loft suddenly felt too exposed, too personal. For years, Mason had carefully avoided speaking about his father at all. It had always been easier that way, cleaner. Now the dead man's face sat openly between them. Travis lowered the photograph slowly. Grandma always said he abandoned you. She believed that. You don't anymore? Mason remained silent long enough for the answer to settle on its own. Ranger crossed the loft quietly and rested beside Travis now, pressing his shoulder lightly against the younger man's knee. Travis scratched absent-mindedly behind the dog's ears. When Mom got sick, he said softly, I thought things would finally get better between us. Mason closed his eyes briefly. Not this conversation. Not yet. But Travis continued, You know what? She told me near the end. Mason looked at him carefully. She said, You were never really home after the teams. Travis swallowed hard. Even when you sat in the room with us, the words hit harder than anger would have, because they were true. Mason stared out the loft window, toward the frozen valley below. He remembered Travis at 8 years old, waiting at Little League games, while Mason sat numb and distant on metal bleachers after deployments. He remembered Linda trying quietly to smooth over the distance, growing between father and son year after year. And he remembered every moment he failed to fix it. I tried, Mason said quietly. Travis nodded once. I know, that almost hurt worse. Ranger remained between them now. Not dividing, bridging. The old Malinois shifted his head from one man to the other, like he understood exactly what neither of them knew how to say. Outside, evening shadows slowly climbed the mountains. The loft darkened. Travis picked up another photograph from the cedar chest. This one showed soldiers beside a derailed rail car, half buried in snow. Several military dogs stood among them. One handler carried a wounded shepherd across his shoulders. Mom used to hate the way you slept after deployments, Travis said quietly while studying the photo. You'd barricade the bedroom doors. Mason looked down. Sometimes, I forgot where I was. You punched a hole through my closet door once, because I walked in behind you too fast. The memory flashed back instantly. Travis, 12 years old, terrified. Mason shaking uncontrollably afterward, while Linda tried to calm both of them. I know, Mason whispered. Travis set the photograph down carefully. I spent years angry at you for that. And now, the younger man glanced around the loft. At some point, I realized you are probably more scared than I was. The words settled heavily between them. Mason suddenly felt exhausted, down to the bone. Not physical exhaustion, the deeper kind, the kind carried by men who spend entire lifetimes trying not to remember things. Ranger moved back beside Mason and leaned heavily against his leg. The old dog's hips trembled slightly now from age and cold. Mason rested one hand automatically on his neck. Clara Whitmore thinks Boone was trying to preserve these men, Mason said quietly after a while. Looks like he did. No, Mason replied softly. I mean preserve them from disappearing. Travis looked around the loft again, the hidden compartment, the ledgers, the folded letters. I think he was waiting for somebody. Mason's eyes lifted slowly. Somebody like you? Maybe somebody who understood military silence. Below them, a sudden loud engine noise echoed through the valley. Both men moved toward the loft windows instantly. Curtis Vane's flatbed truck rolled slowly up the lane again through the snow. This time, he wasn't alone. Another truck followed behind him. Mason narrowed his eyes. What's he doing? Quote, the truck stopped near the carriage house entrance. Curtis climbed out first, heavy boots crunching through snow. The second truck carried chains and salvage equipment in the back. Travis frowned immediately. That doesn't look good. Ranger began growling. Down below, Curtis looked up toward the loft windows and spotted them almost immediately. Even from a distance, Mason could see the calculation in the older man's eyes. He knew something had been found. Curtis cupped his hands around his mouth. You boys planning to come down and talk? Mason didn't move. Travis looked toward him carefully. You know this guy? Enough. Curtis waited another moment in the snow, then shouted upward again. County says this building's condemned after the storm damage. Mason's pulse sharpened instantly. What? Curtis smiled faintly below. And salvage rights get complicated once structures start collapsing. Ranger barked sharply. The wind swept hard across the valley, while snow blew around the trucks parked below. Mason looked back toward the hidden compartment, then toward Curtis, then finally at the old military dog beside him. Something dangerous began tightening inside his chest. Not fear now, but protectiveness. Because for the first time, in a very long while, he had found something worth defending. The wind swept hard across the loft windows, while Mason stared down at Curtis Vane, standing in the snow below, beside the salvage trucks. Ranger's growl deepened, not loud, certain. Beside Mason, Travis crossed his arms tightly against the cold. What's he talking about? He asked. Mason didn't answer immediately. Down below, Curtis lit a cigarette, while one of the younger men beside him uncoiled heavy chains from the second truck bed. Salvage chains. The sight turned something cold inside Mason. He had seen that same casual disrespect before in war zones, after civilian homes got flattened by artillery. Men stepping through somebody else's history like it was debris instead of life. Curtis shouted upward again. You planning to come talk? Or not? Mason finally stepped toward the stairs. Stay up here, Travis frowned. Dad, just stay with the documents. The word Dad hung briefly between them. Small but real. Mason descended slowly into the stable level, with Ranger close beside him. The moment he stepped outside into the snow, the cold hit like broken glass against his face. The valley had turned silver beneath the late afternoon sky, and wind carried loose snow across the dead fields surrounding the carriage house. Curtis watched him approach with narrowed eyes. You look tired, the older man said. Storm kept me up. Curtis glanced toward the loft windows. You find something in there? Mason remained expressionless. Why? Because men don't suddenly start defending condemned buildings unless there's a reason. The younger salvage worker beside Curtis shifted uncomfortably while eyeing Ranger. That dog always stare at people like that? Yes, Mason said flatly. Curtis exhaled cigarette smoke into the wind. County inspector came through town this morning. Heard about the roof collapse. There's still no demolition order yet. Mason said nothing. Curtis stepped closer. boots crunching through the snow. "Look," he said, quieter now. "I know old Boone used to hide things. Everybody around here knows it. Half this valley spent 40 years guessing." Mason felt Ranger press lightly against his leg. Grounding. Warning. "Whatever's inside that barn," Curtis continued. "You was not keeping it safe, living here alone." The statement carried something underneath it. Not concern. Interest. Mason looked directly at him. "What exactly do you think's up there?" Curtis smirked faintly. "War money. Maybe. Gold. Silver. Government stuff." Mason almost laughed. Because Curtis still didn't understand. The most valuable thing hidden inside the Carriage house was not money. It was memory. And men like Curtis never recognized the difference. "You have no claim here," Mason said quietly. Curtis shrugged. "Maybe not legally." The silence sharpened instantly. Ranger stepped forward half a pace. The younger salvage worker backed up immediately. Curtis held his ground. Then finally, he sighed and flicked the cigarette into the snow. "Fine," he muttered. "Freeze to death in there, if you want." He turned toward the trucks, but before climbing inside, he looked back once toward the loft windows. "You know what Boone used to say before he died?" Curtis asked. Mason waited. "He used to tell folks, 'The train still cries through these mountains at night.'" Wind swept across the valley again. Curtis climbed into the truck and drove away slowly, chains rattling in the truck bed, until both vehicles disappeared beyond the tree line. Mason stood alone in the snow a long moment afterward. Ranger remained beside him perfectly still. The mountains surrounding Black Hollow Ridge looked ancient beneath the fading winter light. Silent witnesses, Mason finally looked down at the old dog. "Let's go back inside." Night settled quickly over the Carriage house. The temperature dropped hard after sunset, forcing frost across the stable walls, while wind moaned softly through cracks in the loft above. Travis helped reinforce the damaged tack room ceiling. Using loose beams, Mason found stacked near the stalls. Neither man spoke much while working. The quiet between them had changed, still awkward, but no longer hostile. Ranger lay near the stove, watching both men carefully, while sparks drifted upward through the rusted pipe into darkness. Eventually, Travis sat heavily beside the fire. "I can't believe you've been living like this." Mason tightened another bolt into the support brace. "You'd be surprised what people get used to." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I got." Travis stared into the flames. "You could have stayed with me." Mason stopped working briefly. The invitation surprised him because Travis had not offered that after the funeral. Back then, the anger between them still filled every room. "I wouldn't fit in your world," Mason said quietly. "My world's not that impressive. You've got stability." "And you think that's enough?" Mason looked at him carefully. Then, for the first time, he noticed how tired his son looked beneath the surface. Not physically. Soul tired. Maybe inherited. Ranger suddenly stood and walked toward the loft stairs again. The old dog paused halfway there and looked back at Mason, waiting. Mason sighed softly. "Guess he wants us upstairs again." They climbed together beneath lantern light. The hidden compartment seemed even more haunting at night. Shadows moved softly across the old beams, while wind whispered through the broken roof overhead. Mason reopened the cedar chest carefully. Then he pulled free another sealed envelope buried beneath the journals. This one was different. Smaller. Personal. His hands tightened immediately when he saw the writing across the front. "Lieutenant Samuel Carter." Travis looked over his shoulder. "That's Grandpa's name." Mason nodded slowly. The envelope had never been opened. The seal remained intact after nearly 60 years. For several seconds, Mason simply stared at it. Ranger sat directly beside him, The old dog's breathing remained slow and steady, while snow hissed softly against the roof above them. Finally, Mason slid one finger beneath the brittle seal. The paper cracked open carefully. Inside rested two things: a folded letter and a photograph. The photograph fell first. Travis picked it up carefully. It showed Samuel Carter kneeling beside a German shepherd wearing army transport harness gear. Snow covered the mountains behind them, but that wasn't what froze Mason. The dog in the photograph looked startlingly similar to Ranger. Same dark ears, same alert eyes, same dark marking above the left shoulder. Generations apart, yet somehow connected. Travis turned the photograph over. On the back, faded handwriting read, "Samuel and Bear." He refused to leave the wreckage. Mason swallowed hard, then unfolded the letter. The handwriting differed from Boone's journal. Cleaner, military, precise. If this letter reaches my family, then something has gone wrong. Mason's heartbeat slowed painfully. I know reports may say otherwise, but I did not leave willingly. The derailment trapped several handlers and dogs inside the lower rail cars. Some animals survived the impact, but remained pinned. We are attempting extraction now, despite worsening conditions. If I do not return, tell my son one thing for me. No good soldier leaves his dog behind. Mason stopped reading. The words struck him like a physical blow. Across the loft, the wind suddenly rose hard enough to shake the old beams overhead. Travis stared at his father. Dad. But Mason barely heard him because something inside him had just broken open. All his life, he had imagined abandonment, cowardice, failure. Yet here in his hands lay proof that Samuel Carter died, trying to save trapped soldiers and military dogs during a blizzard in the mountains. Not running from family, not disappearing willingly, dying in service. Mason lowered his head slowly. And for the first time since Linda's funeral, he cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just silent tears slipping down a weathered face, while a lifetime of anger collapsed quietly inside an abandoned loft. Ranger moved immediately beside him. The old Malinois rested his head gently across Mason's lap. Travis looked away respectfully, eyes shining in the lantern light. Outside, the mountains remained wrapped in snow and darkness. Inside the hidden loft, the dead had finally begun telling the truth. Below the letter, folded carefully into the bottom of the envelope, Mason discovered one final page, a rail map, with a red circle drawn around a section of mountain ridge, north of Black Hollow Ridge. Beside it, someone had written 3 words they never found. The lantern flame flickered softly between Mason and Travis, while snow drifted against the loft roof overhead. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. Mason stared down at the map in his trembling hands. The red circle sat deep in the mountain ridges north of Black Hollow Ridge, near an abandoned section of rail lines swallowed long ago by forest and rockslide debris. They never found them. Not recovered, not accounted for, not buried. The meaning settled heavily through the loft. Somewhere in those mountains, men still waited. Ranger rested beside Mason, his breathing slow and steady against the old wooden floorboards. The old Malinois had stopped growling now, as if finding the hidden compartment had completed some mission. Only Ranger seemed to understand. Travis finally spoke quietly. You think there were more bodies? Mason nodded faintly. Maybe rail cars, too. The younger man stared toward the dark loft windows. My God. Wind moved softly through the cracks overhead. Mason folded the map carefully and returned it to the envelope beside Samuel Carter's letter. His hands moved slower now, more deliberate. Not because of age, because everything inside the loft had become sacred. The dog tags, the journals, the letters, never delivered. Proof that people existed, proof they mattered. Ranger lifted his head when Mason carefully stacked the tags back inside the footlocker. The old dog watched every movement closely. "You know what's strange?" Travis asked quietly. Mason looked up. "I haven't seen you focus on something this hard since I was a kid." Mason gave a tired half smile. "Usually. Not a compliment." "No," Travis admitted softly. "Usually it meant you disappeared into your own head for weeks." The words carried no anger now, only memory. Mason sat back against the wall slowly. "When I got back from Afghanistan the second time," he said, "I used to wake up every night convinced I'd forgotten somebody." Travis listened silently. "Not physically forgotten," Mason continued. "More like I had left them behind, somehow." The loft creaked softly around them. "I kept seeing faces. Men we lost. Civilians. Dogs." Mason rubbed tired hands over his beard. "After a while, the brain starts carrying ghosts around." Ranger shifted closer immediately. The old Malinois rested his head on Mason's boot. "Mom used to sit with you after nightmares," Travis said quietly. Mason nodded. "She was better at pulling me back than most therapists." Silence settled again. Outside, the storm clouds had finally broken apart completely, revealing pale moonlight over the snow-covered mountains. The valley below looked frozen in silver glass. For the first time since arriving at the carriage house, the building no longer felt threatening. It felt burdened, like it had been holding its breath for decades. Mason looked around the loft. Slowly. Elias Boone had carried this secret alone for 30 years after the derailment. 30 years of protecting names the government wanted erased. 30 years of waiting for someone else to understand why memory mattered. Mason understood now more than he wanted to. He stood carefully and crossed toward the hidden compartment again. The footlockers remained stacked neatly inside the wall. So many names, so many unfinished stories. Then he noticed another small bundle tucked deep behind the ledgers, oilcloth wrapped, thin, forgotten behind the others. Mason pulled it free gently. Inside lay dozens of unopened notification letters addressed to families across the country. Some carried military stamps. Others had handwritten addresses fading with time. None had ever been mailed. Travis looked stunned. They were never told. Looks like Boone couldn't bring himself to send them. Mason opened one carefully. "Mrs. Eleanor Pierce. It is my duty to inform you." He stopped reading. The old language hit hard. Military condolence notices always sounded the same. Formal words, attempting to compress entire human lives into paragraphs. Mason folded the letter carefully again. "No family should have been left wondering," he whispered. Ranger stood and moved toward the loft stairs, then paused, looked back, waiting. Mason frowned slightly. "What is it?" The old dog descended slowly into the stable level below. Travis followed first. Mason came behind carrying the lantern. Downstairs, the massive carriage house felt calmer tonight. The wind had faded, leaving only the occasional creak of settling beams and the distant sound of snow sliding from the roof outside. Ranger crossed toward the old horse stalls, specifically the first stall near the eastern wall. The faded carving above it read, "August." The old Malinois stepped inside the stall and sniffed near the back corner. Then he sat. Mason approached slowly. "What you find now?" The lantern light revealed something barely visible. Beneath years of dirt, packed against the stone floor. Scratches, deliberate. Mason knelt carefully. Letters had been carved into the wood near the baseboard. B.H. Travis leaned closer. "What does that mean?" Mason's eyes narrowed. Could be initials. Then he remembered the photograph. Samuel Carter's dog, Bear. Bear had refused to leave the wreckage. B.H. Bear and Handler. The realization tightened his chest unexpectedly. Ranger sniffed the carved letters once more before lying quietly inside the stall, almost like standing watch. Mason looked around the old stable. Maybe Boone had housed surviving military dogs here. After the derailment, maybe Bear himself had once slept in this exact stall, while waiting for a handler who never came home. The thought settled heavily over all three of them. Eventually, Travis broke the silence. What happens now? Mason stared toward the loft overhead, the hidden wall, the names, the forgotten dead. I don't know, he admitted. You planning to tell somebody? Who? The army? Maybe historians? Mason almost laughed. You really think institutions like admitting they buried mistakes? Travis looked away because he knew the answer. The stove crackled softly nearby, while the carriage house settled deeper into night around them. Mason suddenly realized how exhausted he felt, not only from the storm, from grief, from truth, from carrying decades of anger toward a father who died, trying to save men and dogs in a frozen rail car. Ranger rose slowly and crossed back toward Mason. The old dog's hips shook slightly now from arthritis. 12 years old, too many deployments, too many injuries, too many miles. Mason crouched beside him carefully. You're getting tired, buddy. Ranger licked his hand once. The dog's eyes still carried the same fierce intelligence they always had, and suddenly Mason understood something that struck him deep. Ranger had been guiding him here from the beginning. The restless night in the Walmart parking lot, the fixation on the carriage house photograph, the wall, the compartment. Not because the dog understood history, because military dogs recognize unfinished duty better than most people do. They are trained for it, built for it. Travis spread additional blankets near the stove, while Mason secured the journals inside the tack room for the night. Hours passed quietly after that. No arguments, no accusations. Only the sound of pages turning while Mason sat reading names aloud from Boone's ledgers beneath lantern light. Private Richard Vale. The fire snapped softly. Sergeant Nolan Pierce. Outside, moonlight silvered the frozen valley. Lieutenant Aaron Mills. Ranger slept beside Mason's boots, ears twitching occasionally at the sound of each name. Travis listened silently from across the room. And slowly something shifted inside the carriage house itself. The loneliness that had haunted the building for decades began loosening, inch by inch. Not because the dead returned, but because someone was finally speaking their names again. Near midnight, Travis quietly asked, "Do you think Grandpa knew Boone hid all this?" Mason stared into the lantern flame. "No," he said softly. "I think Boone became the only witness left." The younger man nodded slowly. Then, after a long silence, said, "You know, Mom never stopped loving you." Mason's throat tightened instantly. "She deserved better than what I gave her. She knew why you struggled. That doesn't excuse it." "No," Travis admitted quietly. "But it explains it." The words lingered heavily between them. Mason looked toward his son carefully now, really looked, and for the first time in many years, he saw not the angry boy from old arguments, but a tired, grown man carrying wounds of his own. Outside, the mountains stood silent beneath moonlit snow. Inside the carriage house, the names continued, one by one, like prayer, like remembrance, like unfinished soldiers, finally being escorted home. And somewhere deep in the night beyond the valley, a train whistle echoed faintly through the mountains. The sound rolled low across Black Hollow Ridge, like a memory too old to die. Mason lifted his head slowly from the ledger in his lap. Across the stable, Travis looked up from the blankets near the stove. Ranger was already awake. The old Malinois stood motionless beside the stall entrance, ears forward, staring toward the dark mountains outside. The whistle came again, distant, mournful, almost swallowed by the wind. Then silence returned. Travis forced a weak smile. There hasn't been an active rail line through these mountains in decades. Mason closed the ledger carefully. "I know. Still, Neither man moved for a while afterward. The carriage house seemed to settle deeper into itself around them. Old beams creaking softly, while moonlight spilled through broken sections of roof above the stalls. Finally, Travis stood and stretched. "You should sleep some." Mason rubbed tired eyes. Sleep felt dangerous lately. Every time he closed his eyes now, faces appeared. Samuel Carter, Elias Boone, the unnamed soldiers trapped in snow and twisted steel, and always the dogs, waiting beside wreckage, refusing to leave. Ranger crossed the stable quietly and rested beside Mason again. The old dog's joints cracked softly as he lay down. Mason scratched gently behind his ears. "Yeah," he whispered. "You're right. Couple hours." By morning, the mountains had turned crystal clear beneath pale winter sunlight. The storm was gone. Smoke rose from distant farmhouses across the valley, while frozen tree branches glittered silver along the ridgeline surrounding Black Hollow Ridge. For the first time since arriving, the carriage house almost looked peaceful. Travis stood outside beside the pickup, drinking coffee from a dented thermos, while Mason inspected the damaged roof line. "We need supplies," Travis said. "Tarps, lumber, fuel." Mason nodded absently. His attention remained fixed on the northern mountains beyond the valley toward the circled location on Boone's map. They never found. The words had not left his mind once during the night. "You're thinking about going up there," Travis said quietly. Mason looked at him. "You read my face too easily. I learned from Mom. That still hurt." Mason exhaled slowly. "Not yet," he said. "Weather's too unstable. But you're going eventually." It wasn't a question. Ranger suddenly stiffened beside the truck. Low growl. Mason turned immediately. A vehicle approached fast down the snowy lane. Not Curtis's flatbed this time. A black county SUV. It stopped sharply beside the carriage house. Clara Whitmore climbed out first, wrapped in a long wool coat, snow crunching beneath her boots, but another man exited behind her. "County Inspector," Mason said, recognizing the clipboard before the expression. "Bad news." Clara approached slowly. "Mason," she said gently. "This is Walter Griggs from County Safety." The inspector barely glanced at Mason before studying the damaged roof. "This structure is unstable after the storm," he announced flatly. "We received multiple complaints already." "From Curtis Vane," Mason guessed. Walter ignored the comment. "Legally, nobody should be staying here." Ranger moved closer immediately. "Protective now." The inspector noticed and stepped back slightly. Clara looked uncomfortable. "I tried slowing this down," she said quietly. "But Curtis has been pushing hard with the county commissioners." Mason folded his arms. "What's the timeline?" Walter opened the clipboard. "Official condemnation review in 72 hours. Travis swore softly under his breath. "If the structure fails inspection," Walter continued, "salvage rights transfer to county disposal contractors. Curtis, of course." Mason looked toward the carriage house, toward the loft, the hidden compartment, the names. If Curtis gained access before the records were secured, decades of preserved history could disappear overnight. Clara lowered her voice carefully. "You need to move whatever matters out of here fast." Mason nodded once. "We will." Walter scribbled notes onto the clipboard, then looked directly at Mason. "And for your own safety, I strongly advise not remaining inside overnight." Mason almost laughed at that. Safety had stopped being a meaningful word years ago. The SUV left shortly afterward. Clara remained behind another minute beside the truck. "There's more," she said quietly, once Walter was gone. Mason waited. "Curtis has been asking questions around town about military valuables." Travis frowned. He thinks there's treasure hidden here. Clara's expression darkened slightly. He's desperate. Development company's been trying to buy this valley for years. Mason looked toward the mountains again. Then he won't stop. No, Clara admitted. He won't. Ranger stared toward the road long after Clara finally left. By afternoon, Mason and Travis worked steadily inside the carriage house, securing the records into weatherproof containers gathered from town. The hidden compartment slowly emptied. Dog tags wrapped carefully, letters preserved, photographs boxed, ledgers stacked. Ranger supervised every movement. The old Malinois followed each item from loft to tack room, as if personally accounting for each one. At one point, Travis smiled faintly while watching him. He seriously thinks this is still in operation. Mason looked toward Ranger. No, he said quietly. He thinks it's still a responsibility. Outside, clouds gathered again by evening. Not another blizzard, but enough wind to rattle the roof beams overhead. The stable level smelled strongly now, of old paper, sawdust, lantern oil, and wood smoke. For the first time in decades, the hidden history of the carriage house stood exposed openly beneath lantern light. Mason sat beside the stove after dark, rereading Samuel Carter's letter, while Travis reinforced loose boards near the stable entrance. Ranger slept nearby. Then came the sound. Truck engine close. Mason stood instantly. So did Ranger. Headlights flashed briefly through the stable cracks outside. "Curtis," Travis muttered. The engine cut off. Silence followed. Too much silence. Mason moved toward the stable doors carefully. Then he smelled it. Gasoline. His pulse sharpened instantly. "Travis." The younger man looked up. "Get the records." Outside, footsteps crunched quickly through snow around the building. More than one person. Ranger exploded into furious barking. Then came the first crash against the outer stable wall. Something shattered outside. Glass. Gasoline spread sharply through the air. Mason lunged toward the doors. Hoof! Flames erupted suddenly along the outer wall near the hay storage side of the carriage house. Fire raced upward instantly. Old dry wood ignited like paper. "Move!" Mason shouted. Smoke poured through cracks overhead, while orange light exploded across the stable interior. Travis grabbed the document cases immediately. Ranger charged toward the staircase, barking wildly. The loft. The remaining records. Mason swore and ran after him. "Dad." "No." But Mason was already climbing into the smoke. The upper loft had become chaos. Flames crawled rapidly across old beams near the western roofline, while black smoke rolled downward through the rafters. The heat hit hard instantly. Ranger raced through the smoke toward the hidden wall. Mason followed, coughing violently. More ledgers still remained beside the compartment. Samuel's photograph, the letters, Boone's journals. He grabbed armfuls blindly. Below them, Travis shouted from the stable, "Hurry!" Then the roof groaned overhead. A massive beam cracked loudly somewhere above the loft. Ranger barked frantically. "Mason!" The old dog lunged toward him too late. The burning beam collapsed across the staircase in an explosion of sparks and smoke. The loft shook violently. Fire surged upward around them. Mason stumbled backward hard, shielding his face against the heat. The only exit was gone. Below, through the flames, Travis shouted in panic. "Dad!" Smoke swallowed the loft rapidly now. Mason dropped to one knee, coughing hard while Ranger circled frantically beside him. Another section of roof collapsed. Nearby, flames roared higher. The heat became unbearable. Mason's vision blurred through smoke and ash. Then Ranger did what military dogs have always done. He came back. The old Malinois charged directly through burning debris toward Mason, ignoring sparks burning into his fur. Mason! Ranger seized the front of Mason's jacket in his teeth and pulled hard, dragging him toward the far side of the loft, toward a narrow maintenance ladder leading through the rear hay doors. The dog had found another exit, but halfway there, another flaming beam crashed down directly behind them. Ranger yelped sharply. Mason turned instantly. The old dog's rear leg had been struck beneath burning debris. Ranger! Smoke swallowed the loft completely. Below, Travis heard his father scream the dog's name, and then the fire surged higher. The entire loft vanished behind rolling black smoke and orange flame. Dad! Travis lunged toward the burning staircase instinctively, but the heat blasted him backward. Before he could reach the first step, sparks exploded downward through the stable aisle, while burning pieces of roof crashed into the stalls around him. Above the roar of the fire came Ranger's bark, sharp, desperate, still fighting. Then Mason appeared briefly through the smoke near the rear loft opening. One arm wrapped around a stack of journals pressed against his chest, the other reaching toward the trapped dog. Ranger! The old Malinois struggled beneath the burning beam, pinning his rear leg. Flames crawled across the dry loft boards around him, while smoke swallowed the ceiling overhead. Mason dropped the journals instantly and grabbed the timber with both hands. The heat tore through his palms immediately. He pulled anyway, muscles shaking. The beam shifted barely an inch. Not enough. Below them, Travis spotted the rear maintenance ladder hanging outside the loft doors, the only way up. Without hesitation, he ran through the snow toward the outer wall of the carriage house, while fire thundered above him. The cold night air outside hit hard after the smoke-filled stable. Flames punched through sections of roof now, sending showers of sparks, spiraling into the dark Appalachian sky. The whole valley glowed orange. Travis seized the iron ladder and climbed fast. Inside the loft, Mason coughed violently, while trying again to lift the beam trapping Ranger. The old dog kept struggling, despite obvious pain. Mason! Travis's voice emerged suddenly through the smoke from the rear loft opening. Mason looked up sharply. His son climbed into the burning loft without hesitation. For one frozen second, their eyes met through the smoke and fire, and Mason saw it. Not anger, not resentment, only determination. The same look soldiers carry when they run toward danger, because somebody they love is still inside. Travis dropped beside the beam immediately. The fire roared around them. Both men lifted. The timber shifted higher this time. Ranger yelped sharply as his injured leg came free. Go! Mason shouted, but the old dog didn't run. Instead, Ranger grabbed the front of Mason's jacket again and pulled hard toward the rear opening. Even injured, even burned, still trying to save him. Another section of roof collapsed nearby in a shower of sparks. The loft floor trembled violently. Travis grabbed the journals, while Mason lifted Ranger into his arms. The old Malinois whimpered once against his chest. Then all three men moved. Smoke blinded them almost immediately. Mason could barely see the rear ladder through the firelight. Below, flames had already spread into the stable level. The carriage house was dying. Travis climbed down first, carrying Boone's journals beneath his coat. Mason followed slowly behind him, with Ranger held tight against his chest, while sparks rained through the darkness around them. Halfway down, the ladder bolts screamed. The fire had weakened the wall supports. Mason! Travis shouted. The ladder jerked violently away from the wall. For one terrible second, all three nearly fell backward into the flames below. Then Mason jumped. He hit the snow hard, with Ranger wrapped against him, while the ladder crashed sideways into the burning stable wall behind them. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs. Snow exploded upward around them. Heat rolled across the field. Travis stumbled down beside him seconds later, clutching the journals. Behind them, the loft windows burst outward in fire. The old carriage house groaned deeply one final time. Then, half the roof collapsed inward. The sound echoed across the frozen valley, like thunder. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Snow hissed softly against burning wood. Mason finally rolled onto his side. Ranger. The old dog lay trembling beside him. Burns covered part of his shoulder and rear leg, but his chest still rose steadily. Alive. Mason pressed both hands gently against the dog's neck. "You stubborn old bastard," he whispered hoarsely. Ranger opened his eyes weakly and thumped his tail once against the snow. Sirens echoed faintly through the valley. Nearly 20 minutes later, volunteer fire crews from Black Hollow Ridge arrived first, followed by county deputies and half the town behind them. People stood silently in the snow, watching the ancient carriage house burn against the mountain darkness. Clara Whitmore found Mason sitting beside Ranger near the tree line, wrapped in borrowed blankets. Her eyes filled immediately when she saw the dog's injuries. "Oh, sweetheart." Ranger rested quietly with his head in Mason's lap, while a volunteer medic treated the burns as gently as possible. Travis stood nearby, blackened with soot, still holding the salvaged journals against his chest like something holy. The fire chief approached slowly. "We couldn't save the structure," he said quietly. Mason nodded once. He already knew. Behind them, the last standing section of the loft collapsed inward beneath a storm of sparks. Nearly 60 years of silence ended in flame, but not erased. Never erased because the names survived. The journals survived. The truth survived. Curtis Vane was arrested before dawn. One of the younger salvage workers confessed almost immediately after deputies found gasoline containers in the truck bed, abandoned near the county road. Mason felt no satisfaction hearing it, only exhaustion. By sunrise, smoke drifted slowly upward from the ruins of the carriage house into a pale winter sky. The mountains surrounding Black Hollow Ridge stood quiet again beneath fresh snow. 1 year later, spring returned softly across the valley. Wildflowers pushed through the thawed fields where snow once buried the ridge roads. The surviving limestone walls had been stabilized, and the carriage house had been carefully rebuilt through donations sent from veterans organizations across the country. After the story spread, letters arrived daily now. Photographs, dog tags, military patches, stories. People mailed memories because they trusted Mason Carter to protect them. The restored lower limestone level became a memorial room dedicated to forgotten servicemen and military working dogs. And above it, rebuilt carefully from reclaimed timber, stood a smaller loft with one preserved section of Elias Boone's original hidden wall displayed beneath glass. Visitors came from everywhere. Old veterans in wheelchairs, families carrying folded flags, former handlers bringing retired military dogs. Some cried quietly while reading the names. Some simply stood in silence. Every evening before closing, Mason lit a lantern beside the memorial wall, and every evening he read the names aloud, one by one, just as Elias Boone once had. Because forgotten soldiers disappear only when nobody says their names anymore. Outside the rebuilt carriage house, Ranger rested slowly on the limestone steps beneath the warm Appalachian sunset. The old Malinois moved stiffly now. The burns had healed, but age finally showed heavily in him. Mason sat beside the dog with one hand resting gently against his scarred shoulder. Across the field, Travis repaired fencing beside the new gravel lane leading toward the memorial building. Sometimes he caught himself glancing toward his father and smiling slightly without realizing it. Not everything between them had healed, but something had reopened. Trust, perhaps, or the beginning of it. Clara emerged from inside, carrying a small cardboard box. "Another package came today," she said softly. Mason opened it carefully. Inside rested a single army dog tag, wrapped beside a faded photograph of a Korean war handler, kneeling beside a shepherd. A handwritten note accompanied it. "Thank you for bringing them home." Mason stared at the words a long moment. Then he placed the tag gently beside the others, inside the memorial case. School children visited that afternoon from Roanoke. One little boy stopped beside Ranger near the steps. "Was he a war dog?" Mason smiled softly. "He still is." The boy looked toward the memorial wall inside. "Why do you read all the names every night?" Mason looked out across the mountains where the old rail lines once disappeared into snow and darkness nearly 60 years earlier, then down at Ranger resting beside him. "Because somebody once forgot them," he said quietly. "And we're not letting that happen again." The sun lowered slowly behind Black Hollow Ridge. Inside the rebuilt memorial hall, lantern light flickered softly across the preserved diary of Elias Boone. Lantern light also touched the photographs of Samuel Carter and the rows of military dog tags, no longer hidden behind walls. As evening settled across the mountains, Mason Carter opened the old journal one more time. Then, beside his loyal dog, and within hearing of the dead he had finally brought home, he began reading the names aloud again. "If you believe no soldier and no good dog should ever be forgotten, type honor down in the comments." Stories like this remind us that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who quietly keep showing up even after life knocks them down. And if these kinds of American stories about loyalty, sacrifice, and standing your ground mean something to you, subscribe and stay with us for the next journey down the quiet road.